All right, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'd like to thank Ileana for getting me out of the gardening today. But it's a privilege for me to welcome you as the keynote speaker, and I think it's my duty today just to talk to you a bit about some of the historical stories from our organisation that's been based in Cheltenham for 70 years. And as many of you know, because I can recognise a few faces, our organisation's responsible for cyber security and signals intelligence. We're officially 104 years old, but I wanted to just draw out some of the themes which you might find interesting today. No. There we go. So I'm going to take you back to the Victorian era, and I don't know if many of you have read our authorised history behind the Enigma. Just quick show of hands. Anybody read our wonderful authorised history? Great. There are a few of you. Can only apologise. So we commissioned our authorised history as part of our centenary in 2019. So Professor John Ferris, who was a Canadian academic at the University of Calgary, was brought in, and over a 4-year period had the honour of writing our history. On the inner sleeve of that book is this image. This is the image of the Victorian telegraphic cable network that spans the globe. You can probably see, even from the back, how important Britain was in that technology and its development, going back to the 1850s. The first international submarine cable that was laid was between Britain and France, 1851. But Britain drove the technology and the development of this transformational shift in telecommunications. It was largely down to one thing, and it was down to commodity. There was a very, very good rubber that was very good at insulating telegraphic cables in seawater. It was called a gutta percha. It's a tree that is based in Malaya, and Britain controlled Malaya. So we controlled a very valuable commodity in the Victorian period. And the government at the time was very interested in driving this ability for the British Empire to communicate with the Dominions. And it transformed the ability to communicate down to hours and days, what would have taken weeks to get a piece of communications, a letter, from one side of the world to the other. So it was a rapid transformation. And the government at the time thought it'd be a really good idea to put in what they called cable sensor officers, or CCOs, into the cable landing stations. And their primary duty was to read our adversaries' telegrams. This was bulk interception before that was a phrase. And you're talking tens of thousands of these telegrams were read every day, and it gave Britain a huge strategic advantage of understanding our adversaries. And you're stepping forward now into the modern domain. One of the most famous stories in our history was in the First World War, and it's the interception of a very famous telegram. So in January 1917, the Germans wanted to carry out unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, and if they did so, they thought they might inadvertently sink an American merchant vessel. So the German foreign minister at the time, Arthur Zimmermann, thought he'd create a distraction, essentially a deception. And it was to propose an alliance with Mexico, giving German support for the Mexicans to invade America, to retake the lands of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The telegram was sent to Mexico on the 16th of January. We think that telegram was intercepted on that network I've just shown you in Porthcurno, in Cornwall, and it was relayed to a cryptanalytic team based in the Admiralty in Room 40 and put in front of a chap called Nigel de Grey, who's one of our best ever code breakers or cryptanalysts. Within hours, he'd partially decrypted the message and realised what he had in front of him. And he gave it to his boss, who was DNI, the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Blinker Hall. And he said, "Would you like to bring America into the war?" And the message was conveyed to the American delegation in London. It worked its way across to Washington. And by April 1917, the US Senate declared war on Germany, which brought a very swift end to the First World War, saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives and the slaughter of the Western Front. So there's been a public misconception that the Americans came into the First World War because of the sinking of the Lusitania, but it was actually the Zimmermann telegram, one of the most famous stories in SIGINT history. But the genesis of our organisation was really the First World War. Going back to 1914, you've got two large land armies opposing each other on the Western Front, the French and the Germans. They were using radio technology in anger for the first time. This technology had evolved over the last couple of decades, and when they were using it to communicate through subunits all the way up to command headquarters. Subsequently, they were developing abilities to intercept those communications and also to decrypt enciphered communications. When the British Expeditionary Force came across the Channel in 1914, it was the French that taught the British how to intercept and decrypt German communications. So our world is all about partnerships, and it still is to this very day. So the War Office set up a code-breaking unit. It was called MI1B and was based in London in the War Office and became very adept at breaking German army cipher systems. Similarly, the Royal Navy or the Admiralty had set up Room 40, which I mentioned earlier. Interception sites had been built on the eastern coast of England to intercept German Imperial Navy communications from North Sea ports and the Baltic Sea. Places like Scarborough, my hometown, and Hunstanton in Norfolk. So these were the earliest interception sites ever built in the world. And over the course of the First World War, MI1B and Room 40 were really pioneering new methods in cryptanalysis and code breaking. We were driving forward development, and there was a realization towards the end of the First World War that we needed an organisation to do this work in peacetime. So the government created the Government Code and Cipher School, GC&CS, which is GCHQ in another name. It was first formed on the 1st of November 1919, based in Watergate House, which is in between the Strand and the Embankment, if you're ever on that part of town in London. It's the old Marconi headquarters building. In 2019, Her Majesty the Queen unveiled a plaque on that building as part of our centenary celebrations. So the organisation was set up. It was established, based in London, and that interwar period was defined by the work on diplomatic communications and the interception of telegrams. One of the things I'm going to try and avoid talking about today is Alan Turing and the Enigma, which is always a challenge for a talk on our history. But I wanted to talk about this machine. So this is the British version of Enigma. And it's an interesting story in its own right. So the Government Code and Cipher School, what became GCHQ, has always had a remit for communication security advice and consultation for government and to the military, something we now hold within the NCSC, and we still continue that work to the present day. For 10 years, the organisation had been nagging the government to invest in new technology, to encrypt our communications. The Germans had the Enigma machine. In 1926, Edward Travis, who would go on to become our director at Bletchley Park, went out to Berlin and bought a machine from the shop. This was a device that was commercially available. It wasn't really brought in to the German military until the mid-1930s. And it was really on the drive of one man, a chap called Wing Commander Oswin Lywood. He was an RAF signals officer based out of Kidbrooke in South London. He borrowed the machine that Edward Travis had bought in Berlin. He brought the Enigma to his workshop and over a 3-year period copied it. The machine on the left is the Mark I, and you can probably see a lot of similarities between that machine and the German Enigma. Plagiarism is a wonderful thing. Why change brilliant? So the concept of the British Type-X was based on the German Enigma. So these machines were introduced in 1937. And these were the machines that were the mainstay of not just British, but also Allied secure communications in the late 1930s, right the way through the Second World War and after the Second World War. In fact, the more modern versions, the later variants of the machine, were still in use by some of our Five Eyes partners in the 1960s. It's also a story of partnerships. You're all aware our most dominant and important partner are the Americans, what is now NSA, the National Security Agency. A huge organisation with almost limitless resources, which we can only envy. In February 1941, the American delegation came to Bletchley Park, and over a number of days was shown what we were doing at Bletchley. So our organisation moved into Bletchley on the 15th of August 1939. About 180 staff. And the most tightly controlled, highly sensitive work was that was done by the team working on the German Enigma. On Churchill's blessing, the American delegation was shown what we were doing against the German Enigma. After that period, we needed an ability to securely communicate with the Americans and to share the decrypted intelligence from the Enigma and the Lorentz decrypts, or the ultra traffic as we used to call it. So we needed a machine. The Americans had a machine called SIGINT. They weren't willing to share the equity around it. We had Type-X. And the British were willing to share the equity, the sensitive equity around this machine. So this became the de facto platform between us and the Americans, and subsequently all our Allied partners. This was the machine that was used to relay the intelligence, but also secure information all over the world, to all theatres. There were hundreds of these machines built. And the machine on the right is the Type 22. And for the 75th anniversary of the signing of Yakuza, so the bilateral agreements with the Americans, which was signed in March 1946, our director, Jeremy Fleming, asked me what we should do to give as a gift to Dernser, the director of NSA. As I mentioned, this is an important machine in the story of our bilateral partnership. So we also wanted a hook on modern technology. So we took one of the rotors from these machines and we engaged some of our innovation labs to create some 3D printed copies of a Type-X rotor. And over numerous trials and tests using various inks and dyes, we recreated an almost carbon copy identical Type-X rotor. If you looked at them side by side, you wouldn't tell the difference, except one is made of plastic and weighs about 10 grams. We got it mounted in a little display cabinet about this big, and Jeremy flew out. Unfortunately, it was the middle of COVID, so he was unaccompanied and he carried it in his hand luggage, which I thought was quite quaint. And the director of NSA General Nakasone was absolutely smoked with getting this gift. So this is an important story, and it's one about plagiarism. Don't ignore that topic. It's a great thing. But why change brilliant? And a story that's often lost in the noise at Bletchley is the story of a different cipher machine that was at play. So when the Germans swept across occupied Europe and set up command headquarters in various European capitals like Strasbourg, Paris, they needed an online cipher machine. The Enigma was an offline cipher machine that was used in the radio networks. But in between these command headquarters in Europe, they set up a teleprinter network. The Bletchley analysts used to call this network the fish network, because each link was given the name of a fish, like bream, roach, tench. And they knew there was a teleprinter at play, and there was a very, very sophisticated cipher machine that was also being used. The machine was called the Lorentz, so there's a picture of it just in the middle there. This machine has 12 rotors. We do have one in our collection. It's about this big. The maths behind this are almost incomprehensible. We often talk about the maths behind Enigma. The maths behind the Lorentz machine are infinitesimally more complex. But two of our best ever cryptanalysts, Brigadier John Tiltman and Bill Tutt, broke this cipher using a pencil and a piece of paper. It was one of the greatest achievements of mankind in the 20th century, genuinely. So it's called the Lorentz because the Lorentz Electric Company in Berlin was commissioned with the design and build of the machine to work on the teleprinter network. So this is a machine that was used to encrypt the most significant strategic messages from the German generals, the most senior commanders in the German High Command, including the communications from Adolf Hitler himself. The Enigma was used to encrypt tactical and operational level communications. This machine was encrypting gold dust. The most important link that Bletchley ever intercepted and worked on during the Second World War was called Jellyfish, which, as many of you who may have a bit of a zoological slant know, is not a fish. However, it was in between Paris and Berlin. So this was von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris and Berlin. And you can imagine what was going over that link in June 1944. But it's an interesting story of technological development. The chap in the bottom left is Dr. Max Newman, a name you might not be familiar with. He was Alan Turing's lecturer at Cambridge. He was one of the best mathematicians in the country. He was brought into Bletchley Park to attack this network. He was told to build a research section, and it took his name, the Newmanry. And they quickly realised this could not be done by hand. Intelligence is only useful if it's timely. So they needed a machine to speed up the decryption process. On the 1st of March 1943, Dr. Max Newman wrote a letter to his boss, Edward Travis, who was director at Bletchley, and it was outlining the design and commission of the world's first digital computer. It's the picture in the top right. It's a machine called the Colossus. It's called a Colossus because it's very big. It was designed and built in 10 months by a team led by Tommy Flowers, one of the best switch engineers of his generation, at the GPO's research station in Dollis Hill in London. It was installed in Bletchley Park in January 1944 and immediately switched on and was shown to be quite temperamental. It moved at 5,000 characters a second, and the team immediately commissioned a second version, which was installed on the 1st of June 1944. 10 of these machines were built and all installed in Block H at Bletchley Park. This was the world's first digital computer. The Americans claimed credit for building the world's first digital computer. It was called the ENIAC. The world's first digital computer was built and installed in Bletchley Park in January 1944. Next year is the 80th anniversary of that event. It was written out of computer history because this stuff was still classified until about 20 years ago. In fact, if you look through some of the computer history journals, there's some interesting side notes to this story about Dr. Max Newman. In September 1945, he took on the Field and Chair of Mathematics at the University of Manchester and helped drive the Computer Machine Laboratory, CML, to build the machine in the top left, the Manchester Baby, which was switched on in June 1948, which is widely regarded by computer aficionados as the world's first proper computer because you could program it, you could store information on it. But you look at the testimonies of the engineers that were involved in that program, Jeff Tootle, Freddie Williams, their testimonies highlighted it was the skills and experience that Dr. Max Newman had learnt at Bletchley with the work on Colossus that helped shape their thinking and their methodology behind building the baby. So Dr. Max Newman has an important part in our history for our organisation, but also the development of all the computers we use today. GCHQ has always been world renowned for its mathematicians, and still is to this day. In the late 1960s, one of those mathematicians in the organisation, James Ellis, started to unpick an algorithm that had been developed during the Second World War by the American Bell Laboratories. He got so far with implementing it, making it a practical tool, and he brought in two of his colleagues, Malcolm Williamson and Clifford Cox. In November 1973, they produced a research paper outlining the basis for what we call public key cryptography. So when you're at home tonight doing your Amazon shopping or your online banking, I'm sure many of you know this, but the underpinning mathematics behind the end-to-end transactions are public key cryptography that was invented, created in Cheltenham in 1973. 4 years after this was developed, an American team developed in parallel a similar methodology. And interestingly, they patented it and they made millions of dollars off the back of it, which really, really hacked off the British team, because this was still classified until 1997. But just last year, all three of the GCHQ mathematicians were admitted to the NSA Hall of Honour, which is quite an accolade for a Brit. So we brought something back. Now, GCHQ has been on a significant journey in the last few years. It was really started by Sir Ian Lobban about 2010, 2011. He wanted our organisation to be more open, to be more transparent. But that was really rapidly transformed during the Edward Snowden leaks. But in 2019, one of our centenary projects was to develop our biggest and most ambitious public exhibition of all time. It was called Top Secret: From Ciphers to Cyber Security, done in partnership with the Science Museum Group. It opened in July 2019 and at the Science Museum in London. It then went on tour. It went to the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester and finished at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. So over the course of those 14 months, bearing in mind we were in 2 COVID lockdowns, this exhibition had 314,000 visitors. There's massive public interest in what this organisation does. We have some of the richest history in the world, and we need to talk about it. So my pitch back to you as an audience, just so you understand where we are in 2023. Many of you will have heard of a new development that's underway to the west of the Ben Hall headquarters building, which is called the Golden Valley development. I've just written a concept paper to put a museum or a visitor attraction, whatever you want to call it, outside the wire on that park, in conjunction with the Borough Council, in conjunction with the developers at Golden Valley. We need investors. We need people to come and help us build something that would be good for the town, but also good for the region and good for the country. We've been here for 70 years, and it's time we did it. It would be a fantastic asset for this country. I'm sure many of you have been to the National Cryptologic Museum just outside NSA's campus in Fort Meade. It's a huge asset for that organisation, and it's time we did it in this country as well. So if anybody of you are interested, come and see me after, but I've got my details up on this next slide. So our authorised history was published in 2020, available from all Goodline retailers. I'd certainly recommend you buying it. But that's all I wanted to talk to you about today, but I just hope you have a great day at the conference, and thank you for listening. Do we want to do questions? In terms of having a museum visitor centre, we're on a journey of transparency. We're doing a lot more. We've got more publicly avowed staff now than ever before. The work of the NCSC really crosses that bridge to public engagements, outreach. A lot of the work that we do, we can talk about. A lot of the work we can't because of the classification. But we need to keep engaging with the public. Yeah. I think we need to do it because we need to win back public trust after the Snowden leaks. I think there's still a journey to be had. And I think the timing is right. We've sort of proved the business case with the Science Museum engagement. We know there's huge public interest in what we do, so let's do it. And I think it's the right thing to do. And I think this town has such an important part of our history for the last 70 years. And we've got an increasing hub now in Manchester and an increasing presence in London. But Cheltenham is our headquarters and has been for 70 years and will continue to be so until I die. So it's an important story to be told just in this town. I mean, some of the stories of how we've engaged with the community are really important. Any other questions? All right, I'll get back to my gardening. Thank you for listening.